It was a Saturday morning in October of 1962, and there were maybe 300 people standing in a muddy field outside of Harlan, Iowa, Shelby County, and not one of them made a sound. Not one. A moment before, there had been laughter. There had been jeering. A man in a pressed white shirt and clean boots had been walking around with his chest out, shaking hands and collecting congratulations he hadn't earned yet. He'd been loud, real loud, the kind of loud that fills a space so completely you almost forget to wonder what it sounds like when it goes quiet. And then it went quiet. Because out there in that field, caked in October clay, leaking a thin ribbon of blue smoke from a cracked exhaust stack, pulling a load that 3 men said couldn't be pulled, was a 1947 Farmall M. Rust on the hood, a crack in the left rear fender held together with baling wire, tires so worn you could see the fabric beneath the rubber in 2 places. And on that tractor sat a 61-year-old man named Earl Mosberger, who had not slept the night before, who had not eaten breakfast that morning, and who had not said a single word to the crowd that was now watching him with their mouths open. Let me tell you about Earl Mosberger, and let me tell you about the day a John Deere dealer from Council Bluffs bet $8,000 that Earl couldn't do what Earl had been doing quietly, stubbornly, and brilliantly his entire life. Shelby County, Iowa, in the autumn of 1962 was the kind of place that made you understand what the word heartland actually meant, not as a metaphor, not as a campaign slogan, but as a physical, breathing, working reality. The corn had been good that year, not great, but good. The rains had come in June when they were supposed to and held off in September when that mattered most. The fields ran from dark green to dusty gold in the space of 6 weeks, and by the first week of October, the combines were moving through the rows like slow orange ships on a calm sea. The town of Harlan sits at the center of Shelby County like a buckle on a belt. In 1962, it had a hardware store, 2 grain elevators, a 5 dime, a John Deere dealership on the south end of Chatburn Avenue, and a diner called Millie's where the coffee was always hot, and the pie was always there, and the gossip moved faster than either one. Farmers gathered at Millie's on Saturday mornings the way men in cities gathered at barbershops. You came for the coffee, you stayed because of what you heard. And what people had been hearing in October of 1962, what had been running through Millie's and the grain elevator and the co-op like a current through wet ground, was the story of Earl Mosberger and Dale Fitch. The air that morning smelled like fresh-cut silage and chimney smoke from the farmhouses lining County Road F58. There was a chill in it, the kind of chill that doesn't threaten, it promises. Winter was coming, but it was still 2 months out, and for now, the sky was the specific shade of blue that only exists in the American Midwest in early October, high and pale and endless. The field where they'd gathered 80 acres of post-harvest stubble belonging to a man named Glenn Pfeiffer, who had agreed to host this spectacle in exchange for having his drainage tile pulled and repositioned free of charge, was soft from a rain 3 days prior. Not muddy in the way that stops work, muddy in the way that makes work honest. 300 people, farmers, wives, kids who'd skipped school, 2 reporters from the Harlan Tribune, a photographer named Bill Schieffer, who would later say that what he captured that morning was the best photograph he never got published. They were all there to see one thing. They wanted to see whether an old man on an old tractor could do the impossible. Or whether Dale Fitch's brand new John Deere 4010, $8,000 of diesel power and engineering pride, would prove that the old ways were finished. Earl Mosberger was born in 1901 in Westphalia, Iowa, a small German Catholic community in Shelby County that had been farming the same land since the 1870s. His father, Heinrich Mosberger, had broken that ground with a team of Belgian draft horses and a walking plow, and he told Earl something when Earl was 9 years old that Earl never forgot. He'd said, "The machine doesn't matter. What matters is the man who understands it." Earl never went past the 8th grade. That wasn't unusual for a farm boy in rural Iowa in 1915. You needed to read, you needed to count, and then you needed to work, and Earl worked. From the time he was 12 years old until the time he was 61, Earl Mosberger worked land in Shelby County with the kind of consistency that doesn't make news because it doesn't need to. He was 5'8" on a good day, lean the way farm men get lean not from dieting but from never stopping moving. His hands were the color of old saddle leather and roughly the same texture. His eyes were gray-blue like creek water in winter, and they had the quality that some old farmers' eyes have of seeming to look at something slightly behind whatever they're pointed at, like they're always calculating, always working a problem. He'd bought the 1947 Farmall M in 1948, used from a neighbor who was upgrading, paid $340 for it, which was most of what he had. His wife, Clara, had not complained. She'd understood. She always understood. The Farmall M was a good tractor when it was new. By 1962, it was 15 years old and had been worked hard every single one of those years. Earl had rebuilt the carburetor twice, replaced the magneto once. He'd bored out the cylinders himself in the winter of 1956 when the engine started losing compression, working in his unheated shop by the light of a trouble lamp, his breath making small clouds in the 20-degree air. His neighbors had been after him for years to upgrade, to get something newer, something with more power and a live PTO and hydraulics that worked the way hydraulics were supposed to work. Earl always smiled and nodded and then went back out and climbed on the M. Here's what his neighbors didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Earl Mossberger understood that tractor the way a surgeon understands a human body. He knew its compression ratio. He knew exactly how it behaved when the ground changed from sandy loam to heavy clay. He knew how to weight it, how to gear it, how to read the sound of the engine and adjust his throttle in real time to keep the machine working at its absolute peak efficiency. He had over 15 years of intimate mechanical relationship, turned a used tractor of ordinary capability into something extraordinary, not by adding to it, but by understanding it completely. The problem was Earl never talked about any of this. He was a quiet man, always had been. And quiet men in this world have a way of being underestimated. Dale Fitch was 34 years old in 1962, and he had never in his life been quiet about anything. He'd grown up in Council Bluffs, Pottawatomie County, the western edge of Iowa, the son of a machinery dealer who'd built a respectable business selling international harvester equipment after the war. When IH started losing ground to John Deere in the late 1950s, Dale had done what he considered a bold and visionary move. He'd switched dealerships, taken on a John Deere franchise, and by 1961, he was running the most aggressive JD dealership within a 40-mile radius of Harlan. Dale Fitch was not a stupid man, that's important to say. He understood sales, he understood leverage. He understood how to walk into a room and make himself the center of it, which he did by being louder than everyone else, better dressed than everyone else, and critically, by making sure everyone around him understood that he was more modern, more forward-thinking, and more prosperous than they were. He drove a 1962 Ford Galaxy, white with red interior. He wore khaki slacks to farm equipment demonstrations. His boots were always clean. The spring of 1962, John Deere had released the 4010, a machine that was legitimately a remarkable piece of engineering. Turbocharged diesel engine, 84 horsepower at the drawbar, synchro-range transmission, power steering, hydraulic draft control. It weighed 7,000 pounds and it pulled like a locomotive, and Dale Fitch had taken delivery of 3 of them, and he was going to sell them if he had to drag every farmer in Shelby County by the collar to prove they needed one. He'd been running demonstrations across the county all summer. He'd been putting the 4010 against older equipment and letting the machine do the talking, and it had worked, and he'd sold 11 units at $8,000 apiece, and he was feeling very, very good about himself. The problem, his problem, though he didn't know it yet, was that Dale Fitch confused the superiority of his machine with his own superiority as a man. He'd started to believe that because the 4010 was better than anything that had come before it, anyone who wasn't buying a 4010 was either too poor or too stupid to recognize the future. He'd said as much out loud at Millie's Diner one Saturday morning in September of 1962 when Earl Mossberger's name had come up. Someone had mentioned that Earl was still on that old Farmall M, still pulling with it, still doing work that some folks thought you needed a bigger tractor to do. And Dale Fitch had laughed, a short, dismissive laugh, the laugh of a man who considers something too obvious to require serious response, and said, "Earl Mossberger and his antique can play in the past all they want. The rest of us have got work to do." Word gets around in Shelby County. It always does. And when it got back to Earl Mossberger, who heard it third hand from his neighbor Roy Hilgenbrink on a Tuesday evening, Earl sat with it for a long time, didn't say much, Clara asked him what he was thinking about. He said, "I'm thinking about Saturday." Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone dismissed you, not with anger, not with any particular heat, but with a kind of casual contempt that's somehow worse? The kind of dismissal that says, "You're not even worth the energy of a real argument." That's what had been done to Earl Mossberger. And in Shelby County in 1962, among men who took their work and their character as seriously as they took anything on earth, that kind of dismissal didn't go unanswered. But Earl didn't confront Dale Fitch directly. That wasn't his way. What happened instead was that Roy Hilgenbrink, who had a gift for organizing things and a long memory for grudges that weren't even his, made some phone calls. Roy talked to Glenn Pfeiffer about using his harvested field. Roy talked to Frank Oberman at the county co-op, who had himself been on the receiving end of Dale Fitch's condescension. And Roy talked to Bill Schieffer at the Tribune. By the first week of October, what had started as a comment over coffee had become an event. The terms were simple. Earl Mossberger and his 1947 Farmall M would go head-to-head against Dale Fitch's flagship John Deere 4010 in a pulling and tillage demonstration on Glenn Pfeiffer's field. Both machines would pull a loaded clay-busting disc, the heaviest implement either machine could reasonably be attached to, through a measured quarter-mile course in the wet bottom ground of Pfeiffer's field, where the clay content ran heavy, and the resistance would be real. Whoever covered the course faster in a cleaner pull without spinning out or losing ground contact won. The stakes, and this is the part that made it news, were Dale Fitch's own suggestion. When Roy Hilgenbrink showed up at the JD dealership on Chatburn Avenue to propose the contest, Dale Fitch had laughed again. The same laugh. And then, because he was a man who had confused confidence with certainty, he'd said, "You want stakes? Fine. If that old piece of junk beats my 4010, I'll write Earl Mossberger a check for $8,000, the price of a brand new tractor. And if it doesn't, and it won't, Mossberger buys a 4010 at full price." Roy Hilgenbrink had shaken Dale Fitch's hand before the man finished his sentence. It was agreed. Saturday, October 6, 1962. Glenn Pfeiffer's bottom ground off County Road F58, Shelby County, Iowa. And now here is where I want you to understand what the morning of October 6th felt like, because it matters. The crowd began gathering at 7 in the morning. By 8:30, there were pickup trucks parked along a quarter-mile of gravel road, nose to tail. People had brought lawn chairs. One woman had brought a coffee urn from the Methodist church basement and was selling cups for a nickel. The Harlan High School football team had come because their coach, who farmed on the weekends, had told them to. Dale Fitch arrived at 8 o'clock in his white Galaxy, the 4010 trailing behind on a flatbed truck. He'd had the tractor detailed. It was green and yellow, and it gleamed, even under the pale October sun, with the confidence of the new. He had 2 mechanics with him in matching JD green shirts. He walked the field, pointed at the clay, nodded approvingly at conditions that any reasonable man would have found challenging, and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This is exactly the kind of ground the 4010 was built for." He shook hands with the crowd like a politician. He clapped men on the shoulder. When someone asked him if he was worried, he laughed that same laugh and said, "About what?" Earl Mossberger arrived at 8:15 in his '54 Ford pickup, pulling the Farmall M on a 2-wheel implement trailer. His son, Gary, who was 19 and big and quiet like his father, drove. Earl sat in the passenger seat. He stepped out of the truck, looked at the field for a long moment, and then began walking the course the way a man walks land he's about to ask something of. Slowly, deliberately. He stopped in 3 places, crouched down, pressed his hand into the ground. He was reading it. The moisture content, the clay structure, the way the ground would respond to weight and torque, and the power applied at different angles. Nobody paid much attention to him doing this. That was a mistake. When Dale Fitch noticed Earl doing it, he wandered over with 2 of his mechanics and said, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, "You checking to see if it's soft enough for that old thing to make an impression, Earl? Don't worry. We'll let you go first so the crowd can see what a real pull looks like afterward." There was laughter, a lot of it. Earl looked up at Dale Fitch. He looked at him for a long moment with those gray-blue eyes. And then he stood up, brushed the clay off his knee, and walked back to his truck to get his tools. He didn't say a word. Here's what you need to understand about the 1947 Farmall M to understand what happened next. By 1962, the Farmall M was not a new tractor. It had been introduced in 1939 and was considered a mid-sized general-purpose machine, powerful enough for serious work but not in the heavyweight class. Its engine was a four-cylinder gasoline unit, the C264, displacing 264 cubic inches, and from the factory it produced around 33 horsepower at the drawbar. 33 horsepower against the 4010's 84. On paper, there's no contest. On paper, Dale Fitch had already won. But Earl Mossberger had not spent 15 years on that tractor learning what it said on paper. What Earl knew, what he had learned through thousands of hours of direct, physical, sensory experience, was a set of truths about mechanical efficiency and draft tillage that most engineers of his era understood theoretically, but most operators never discovered practically. The first truth was about weight distribution and tire slip. When you're pulling a loaded disc through heavy clay, raw horsepower is only part of the equation. What matters equally is how efficiently that power reaches the ground. A heavier tractor with more power will spin its tires in wet clay and lose traction, bleeding off the very power advantage it carries. Earl had learned to weight the M precisely. Cast iron wheel weights on the rear, water ballast in the tires, calculated to a point of traction efficiency that a bigger machine couldn't match in those conditions. He'd done the math, by hand in pencil in a notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer. The M, properly ballasted in wet clay loam, could transfer a higher percentage of its available power to the ground than the 4010 in the same conditions, because the 4010, at 7,000 pounds, would exceed the traction threshold of the soil and begin to slip before it reached its power potential. The second truth was about the implement angle and draft angle, the geometry of how a disc cuts through soil. Earl had modified the hitch geometry on his M over the years, a series of small, careful adjustments that changed the angle at which the implement entered the soil. An implement set at the wrong draft angle requires dramatically more power to pull than one set correctly. Earl's disc hitched to his M was set to within fractions of a degree of optimal draft angle for heavy clay soil at field capacity moisture. Dale Fitch's mechanics had hitched the disc to the 4010 at standard factory settings. Standard factory settings are designed for average conditions. They had not walked the field with their hands in the clay. The third truth, and this is the one that matters most, the one that is hardest to explain and easiest to feel, was about throttle management. The MC264 engine had a specific power curve, a range of RPMs where it produced torque most efficiently. Earl knew that curve the way a musician knows a song. He didn't operate by the tachometer. He operated by sound, by feel, by 33 horsepower vibrating up through the seat, through his legs, into his hands on the steering wheel. He could feel in real time when the engine was working optimally and when it was laboring unnecessarily, and he modulated the throttle, tiny, constant adjustments, to keep that engine in the sweet spot of its power curve for the entire pull. No one had taught him this. No engineering school, no John Deere training seminar. He had learned it the way farmers learn things, by paying attention to the machine under him day after day for 15 years until it was as natural as breathing. That Saturday morning, before the pull began, Earl Mossberger spent 45 minutes on his preparations. He checked the tire pressure on both rear wheels and let a precise amount of air out of the left one. The ground on that side of the course ran slightly softer. He checked and adjusted the wheel weights. He walked to the implement, checked the disc gangs in the hitch, made 2 small adjustments with a wrench, and then stood back and looked at the whole setup for a long time. Gary had learned not to ask questions during this process. He stood nearby and watched and handed his father tools when asked. At one point, Dale Fitch's lead mechanic wandered over and looked at what Earl was doing to the hitch. He studied it for a moment, frowning. Then he went back to the 4010 and had a quiet conversation with Dale that Earl couldn't hear. Dale glanced over at Earl. Earl didn't look up. The format was simple. Each tractor would make one pull, a quarter mile through the wet bottom section of Pfeiffer's field, pulling the same loaded disc implement, same course measured from the same stake. Time would be kept by Frank Oberman with a stopwatch. 2 neutral observers, both farmers, neither connected to Earl or Dale, would walk alongside and judge whether the pull was clean. No spinning, no loss of ground contact on the implement, full coverage width maintained. Dale Fitch won the coin toss. His 4010 would go first. The crowd moved to the edges of the course. Some climbed up onto the hoods of trucks to see better. The photographer, Bill Schieffer, positioned himself at the far end of the course so he could shoot back toward the crowd. Dale's mechanics hitched the disc to the 4010. The big green tractor sat at the start line, idling with the low, even authority of a diesel engine at rest, a sound that is genuinely impressive. It sounds like power. It sounds like the future. Dale Fitch climbed up into the cab. He settled himself. He looked out at the crowd and he gave a small wave, almost a salute. The crowd cheered. Frank Oberman raised his hand, then dropped it. And the John Deere 4010 moved. Let me tell you, that tractor pulled. For the first 150 yards, it pulled the way it was built to pull. The diesel wound up, the big rear tires bit into the clay, and the disc cut through the ground in a clean, wide swath. The crowd was vocal. You could hear men saying, "Well, there it is." You could hear someone behind Bill Schieffer say, "This is over already." And then, at approximately the 180-yard mark, the left rear tire broke loose. Not catastrophically, not a complete spin-out, but the clay in that section of the course, which Earl had tested with his hand, which Earl had crouched over, which Earl had understood was wetter and softer than the section before it, and at that moisture content, 7,000 pounds of tractor simply exceeded the traction threshold of the soil. The tire slipped just for a moment, just 3 or 4 rotations. But the two neutral observers saw it, they noted it, and it happened twice more in the final 100 yards of the pull, each time brief, each time noted. The 4010 finished the course. Time 4 minutes 18 seconds. 2 observed tire slip events in the final quarter of the course. Dale Fitch climbed down from the cab. The crowd applauded. Dale walked back toward the start line with his hands in his pockets, and if you were watching closely, and Earl was watching closely, you could see that something in his expression had changed. The absolute certainty had developed a crack in it, small, but there. He'd felt the slips, he knew. Earl Mossberger was already on the M when the 4010 cleared the course. He hadn't watched Dale's pull from the crowd. He'd watched from the seat of his tractor, engine idling, hands on the wheel, listening to the ground. Gary came over and put his hand on the rear fender of the M for a moment. Earl looked at him. Gary nodded. Earl nodded back. Frank Oberman raised his hand. And here is what 300 people saw next, and what those of them who are still alive have never forgotten. The Farmall M, rust on the hood, baling wire on the fender, tires worn to the fabric in 2 places, moved off the start line with a sound that was entirely different from the 4010's diesel authority. It was a gasoline engine sound, older, rougher, a 4-cylinder clatter that in no way suggested power or modernity or anything that would make you confident. But the disc bit immediately, completely, no tentative entry, no adjustment period. The implement went into the ground at precisely the angle Earl had calculated, and the M pulled it like the ground had been waiting for exactly this. The crowd was quiet in a way they hadn't been for the 4010. The 4010 had inspired noise, the M inspired watching. Earl's hands on the wheel were almost still. His throttle hand made small, constant adjustments, barely visible from 10 feet away, impossible to detect from farther. He was listening to the engine the way you listen to someone telling you something important. He was hearing the tone change by fractions as the ground resistance shifted, and he was answering each change before it became a problem. At the 180-yard mark, the same section that had broken the 4010's traction, Earl had already made his adjustment. 30 yards before that section, he'd modulated the throttle slightly, backing off just enough to reduce the torque demand on the rear tires by a calculated margin, keeping the load at the traction threshold rather than above it. The M moved through that section without a slip. The two observers looked at each other. The M moved through the final 100 yards with the same grinding, determined, absolutely complete authority it had carried for the entire pull. The disc behind it cut clean and full and uninterrupted. It crossed the finish line. Frank Oberman looked at his stopwatch. He looked at it again. He walked over to the second observer, a man named Clarence Dunneman who farmed 300 acres east of town and had no stake in this contest at all, and showed him the watch. Clarence Dunneman said, and several people standing nearby heard him say it, "Well, I'll be a son of a gun." 4 minutes 2 seconds. 16 seconds faster than the 4010. 0 tire slip events. Complete coverage width for the entire quarter mile. Earl Mosberger climbed down from the Farmall M. He walked over to the implement and looked at the disc gangs. He crouched down and looked at the soil it had turned. He stood back up and looked at the field. Then he turned around and walked toward the crowd. 300 people. And not one of them made a sound. There is a particular quality to the silence that falls over a crowd when something has happened that nobody expected, something that has rearranged their understanding of how things work. It's not the silence of boredom. It's not the silence of confusion. It's the silence of recalibration, of 300 minds simultaneously updating. Dale Fitch stood at the edge of the course with his two mechanics. His white shirt was still pressed. His boots were still clean because he hadn't walked on the ground. His face and Bill Schieffer caught it with his camera, though the photograph never made it into the Tribune because the editor thought it was too harsh, was the face of a man watching a thing happen that his entire professional identity had told him was impossible. He'd bet $8,000 on certainty. And certainty had just pulled a quarter-mile of wet clay in 4 minutes and 2 seconds on a 15-year-old gasoline tractor with baling wire holding the fender together. Frank Oberman announced the times. He did it clearly and without editorializing because Frank was a man who understood that the facts, stated plainly, were sufficient. 4 minutes, 18 seconds, 2 traction slip events, John Deere 4010. 4 minutes, 2 seconds, 0 traction slip events, 1947 Farmall M. The silence held for another moment. And then, not laughter, not cheering, but something quieter and more lasting, a sound moved through that crowd that was halfway between an exhale and an acknowledgement. Men started talking to each other in low voices. Heads nodded. Hands were put in pockets. Earl Mosberger stood near his tractor and waited. Dale Fitch walked over to him. It took him a while to cross those 40 yards. When he got there, he stood in front of Earl, and the two men looked at each other. And Dale Fitch, to his credit, and this does credit him because it would have been very easy and very human to find an excuse, to protest the judging, to claim the conditions were different for his pull, Dale Fitch reached into his shirt pocket and took out his checkbook. He wrote a check for $8,000 standing in the mud of Glenn Pfeiffer's bottom field in front of 300 people, and he handed it to Earl Mosberger. Earl took the check, he looked at it, he folded it once and put it in the breast pocket of his canvas jacket. Then he said, and these were, by several accounts, the first words he had spoken all morning publicly, "Appreciate it." 2 words. Dale Fitch nodded. He walked back to his white Galaxy. His mechanics loaded the 4010 onto the flatbed in silence. The truck pulled out of the field and drove south on County Road F58 until it was gone. The crowd began to break up slowly, the way crowds do when the event is over, but nobody quite wants to leave yet, because something has happened that they want to stay near for a little longer. Roy Hilgenbrink found Earl standing by the M and shook his hand for a long time without saying anything. Gary Mosberger, who was 19 and big and had watched his father his whole life, walked over and stood next to him, and the two of them looked out at the field together. Clara Mosberger, who had come in their neighbor's car and stood at the back of the crowd the whole morning, walked across the field to her husband. She didn't say anything either, she just took his arm. The old tractor idled behind them, cooling in the October air, the exhaust stack putting out its thin blue ribbon of smoke against that high, pale Midwest sky. Now let me tell you what happened after. The $8,000 check cleared Dale Fitch's bank account on October 9, 1962. Earl Mosberger deposited it at the First National Bank of Harlan. He didn't buy a new tractor. He used $4,000 to pay off the remaining note on his farm, a debt he'd carried since 1951. The last piece of a mortgage that had taken him 11 years to retire. The other $4,000 he put in savings. He kept driving the M. The Harlan Tribune did run a story not on the front page, but on page 3 below the fold with a single paragraph describing the outcome of what they called an informal equipment demonstration. Bill Schieffer's photograph of Dale Fitch's face, that photograph of recalibration, of certainty colliding with reality, never ran. The editor said it was unkind. Bill Schieffer kept the print. He died in 1987, and his daughter found it in a box in his basement and hung it in her kitchen, where it hangs to this day. Dale Fitch continued operating his John Deere dealership in Council Bluffs. He sold the Harlan franchise 18 months after the pull. He was not a bad man, I want to be clear about that. He was a man who had confused the quality of his product with the quality of his understanding, and that is a confusion that costs people something, sooner or later. He went on to build a reasonably successful farm implement business in western Iowa. He became, by all accounts, more careful about what he said in public. He never came back to Harlan. Earl Mosberger farmed his 320 acres in Shelby County until 1971, when a minor heart attack persuaded him to lease out the crop ground and keep only the cattle operation. He kept the M. He used it for loader work and odd jobs around the farmstead until 1978, when the loader hydraulics finally gave out, and the cost of rebuilding them outweighed the practical value of the work. He parked it in the machine shed. He didn't sell it, he didn't scrap it. He put a wooden pallet under the tires to keep them off the concrete and draped a canvas tarp over the cab and left it there. Clara died in 1979. They had been married for 41 years. Earl continued to live on the farm with Gary, who had by then taken over the cattle operation and added 200 acres of rented ground. Gary's wife, Patty, cooked for all of them and kept the farm accounts and ran the household with the efficiency of someone who understood that the work was always larger than the time available for it. In the spring of 1983, at the height of what we now call the farm crisis, when land values across Iowa and Nebraska and Missouri were collapsing, when men who had borrowed against their land at 1978 prices were watching those prices fall 30, 40, 50%, when the foreclosure notices were running in the newspaper week after week like a ledger of broken lives. A young loan officer from the Harlan branch of a Des Moines bank came out to the Mosberger farm to review Gary's operating line of credit. The young man's name was David Kellner. He was 27 years old and he drove a company car and he wore a tie, and he had been sent by his superiors to begin the process of reducing the bank's agricultural exposure in Shelby County. He sat at the kitchen table with Gary Mosberger and went through the numbers. The land value had dropped. The cattle prices were soft. The operating line was larger than the bank was comfortable with in current conditions. Earl Mosberger sat in the corner of the kitchen through this meeting. He didn't say much, he listened. When the young loan officer had finished his presentation of the bank's concerns, there was a silence. And then Earl from his corner said, "What do you need to see?" David Kellner looked at the old man. He said he'd need to see the equipment, the cattle, the buildings. Earl took him on a 2-hour tour of the farm. He showed the young man the cattle, 86 head, in good condition, well-fed, healthy. He showed him the buildings, which were maintained beyond what their age suggested. He showed him the accounts, which Gary kept in precise order going back 11 years. And then Earl took him to the machine shed and showed him the 1947 Farmall M under its canvas tarp. He pulled the tarp back and said, "That tractor's 21 years older than you are, still runs. I rebuilt it myself. Everything on this farm I've maintained the same way." David Kellner looked at the old M for a long moment. He approved the operating line. He told Gary afterward, Gary remembered this, that it was the tractor that convinced him, not the numbers, not the cattle, the tractor and what it said about the kind of men who ran this operation. The Mosberger farm survived the farm crisis. 16 of their neighbors in Shelby County did not. Earl Mosberger died on February 14, 1989, Valentine's Day, which Clara would have appreciated at the age of 87 in the farmhouse where he had lived for 53 years. Gary was with him. At the funeral, Roy Hilgenbrink, who was 76 years old and had driven from Harlan through a February sleet storm to be there, said to Gary afterward, "Your father was the smartest man I ever knew, and he never once felt the need to tell you so." The Farmall M is still in the machine shed. Gary Mosberger, who is now in his 80s, keeps it there under the same canvas tarp. He has been offered money for it several times by collectors, by museums, by a television production company making a documentary about antique farm equipment. He always says no. He says it's not for sale. He says some things aren't. Let me pause here at the end of this story and ask you something I've been thinking about the whole time I've been telling it. Why did 300 people stand in a muddy field in Shelby County, Iowa, on a Saturday morning in October of 1962 to watch an old man on an old tractor? It wasn't really about the tractor, was it? It was about something they already believed, something they'd seen threatened, something they were afraid was being taken from them by the noise and the salesmanship and the relentless forward march of the modern, and they needed to see whether it was still true. They needed to see whether a man who understood his work completely, who had paid attention when nobody was watching, who had invested not money but time and care and intelligence into mastering what he had rather than chasing what was newer, they needed to see whether that man could still matter in a world that kept telling him he was finished. And Earl Mosberger answered that question in 4 minutes and 2 seconds. Here is what I take from Earl's story. The world will always have Dale Fitches. It will always have men who confuse the quality of their tools with the quality of their thinking. Men who believe that because they have access to something more powerful, more expensive, more modern, they themselves are more powerful, more worthy, more right. These men are not always wrong about their tools. The 4010 was a genuinely superior machine in most conditions. John Deere built something remarkable. Dale Fitch was not lying when he said that. But he was wrong about what mattered. He'd never learned that knowing a machine, truly knowing it, the way you know something you've lived with and worked with and rebuilt with your own hands, is a form of intelligence that no horsepower rating can replace. Earl Mosberger never said a word against the 4010. He never argued with Dale Fitch's claims. He didn't write a letter to the Tribune or stand at Millie's counter and make speeches about the virtue of the old ways. He just understood what he had. He understood it completely. And when the ground was right and the moment was right, that understanding was worth more than 84 horsepower. There's something else here, too. Something I think about when I think about the farm crisis of the 1980s and the 16 neighbors who didn't make it through, while the Mosbergers did. Earl had spent 40 years building something that the bank couldn't fully quantify, but that young David Kellner could recognize when he saw it. A farm that was maintained not for show, not for the next loan application, but because maintenance was the right thing to do. A machine was kept not because it was worth money, but because it still worked and it was his, and he took care of what was his. That's not just a philosophy about tractors. That's a philosophy about life. About relationships, about communities, about the quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of maintaining the things that matter before they break, not waiting for the crisis, not responding to the emergency, but doing the daily, patient, invisible work of keeping things sound. Earl Mosberger never became famous. The story of the pull at Pfeiffer's Field didn't make the national news. Most people in Shelby County who remember it are in their 80s now, and when they go, the story goes with them unless someone tells it. And that's why we're here. That's what this channel is for. These men and women, the quiet ones, the ones who never needed an audience to do their best work, the ones who understood that the real competition isn't with the man in the next field, but with the weather and the time and the ground itself, they deserve to be remembered. Not because they were perfect, not because the old ways were always better, but because they understood something that is genuinely hard to hold onto in a world that keeps moving faster. That depth of understanding, earned slowly, is worth more than any shortcut. That patience is not the same as passivity. That quiet is not the same as giving up. And that sometimes, on a cold October morning in Iowa, in front of 300 people who needed to believe it was still true, sometimes the old machine wins. The next time you see something old, something worn, something that's been passed over and underestimated and overlooked, ask yourself what it knows that nobody's bothered to ask about. Ask yourself what Earl would see.